A Pal for Gary is largely considered to be one of the worst episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants. You'll often find it in a top 10 worst SpongeBob episode list. However, if you're a watcher of this channel, you know by now that I have a much different opinion on SpongeBob than most cartoon reviewers. And I'm not trying to be a contrarian. In fact, despite the title and thumbnail of my Band Geeks video, I think the episode is just okay. Not the best, but, you know, it's alright. Personally, I just happen to like a lot of what SpongeBob has to offer, and A Pal for Gary is no exception, as I quite enjoyed the episode. The episode is about SpongeBob thinking that by leaving Gary home alone, Gary becomes depressed and lonely when SpongeBob isn't there, which is the exact opposite in reality. But SpongeBob's anxiety gets the better of him as he adopts Puffy Fluffy, a mythical creature owned by an old lady, who explains that these creatures are extremely hostile to other pets, but this falls on deaf ears. So SpongeBob brings Puffy Fluffy home and chaos ensues, with SpongeBob thinking that Gary is being mean to Puffy Fluffy, while it's the exact opposite in reality. Now, I'll be upfront, I can understand why people don't like this episode. SpongeBob is very oblivious here, and Gary gets the short end of the stick. And I could see why people don't like the idea of Gary being treated poorly in some episodes, because he's the underwater equivalent to a kitty cat. But I don't really view Gary on the same level as a real-life cat. I kind of view him the same way I do most cartoon cats, like Tom or Sylvester, simply because he has a lot of personality. Now, if this was Season 1 Gary that barely had any character and was closer to an actual kitty cat, I'd probably be a bit more adverse to this episode, but even still, SpongeBob isn't like Aqua Teen where they'll just show a cat explode in a microwave. It's a much more Looney Tunes-esque show that makes this type of stuff too goofy to be taken seriously. Speaking of Looney Tunes, I did notice a connection between this episode and a series of shorts Looney Tunes did, specifically the Porky and Sylvester shorts. In these shorts, Porky will act as the very oblivious pet owner, while the non-talking scaredy cat Sylvester will often encounter things that could potentially harm both him and Porky. Now, A Pal for Gary isn't set up the exact same way as these shorts, since in A Pal for Gary, SpongeBob brings the danger home, while in Porky and Sylvester shorts, they travel to scary places that have danger. But SpongeBob's obliviousness here mirrors Porky, and Gary fighting off Puffy Fluffy mirrors Sylvester trying to protect Porky. I mentioned earlier that SpongeBob's obliviousness is a reason people dislike this episode, but personally, I find it quite funny here. SpongeBob thinking Gary is the one attacking Puffy Fluffy is just very funny to me. It reminds me of the ending of Jumping Jupiter, where after Porky and Sylvester land on an alien planet, Porky walks out of his tent and still thinks that they're on Earth, and he and Sylvester drive to Albuquerque. Seeing how far their obliviousness goes to the point of delusion is just funny to me. But enough of comparing this episode to Looney Tunes. How is this episode as a SpongeBob episode? This episode has the dry and sometimes fucked up humor that Post Movie has, and I think they do a good job. It's quite a funny SpongeBob episode. You get a lot of great jokes here and there, and who can forget the line, "Great, now my enchiladas are cold." I also really like the contrast between the very adorable Puffy Fluffy to the grotesque monster that he becomes later on. It's funny, sure, but it also just looks really cool on screen. As for things I didn't care for, there wasn't a whole lot, to be frank. The slow pacing does make the episode drag a bit, but I also believe the slow pacing is kinda needed for the dry humor to work, but maybe it could have been a bit faster, I'm not really sure. I'd probably give this episode a 7 or 8 out of 10. It's quite a funny episode, and there are a lot of things I liked, but it's also a pretty run-of-the-mill episode of the show, which I don't think is a bad thing, but it's gonna affect how I rate the episode. One last thing I want to talk about is Doug Walker's video about A Pal for Gary. Now, I understand that Doug Walker doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to reviewing media, but truth be told, I did enjoy this video, because it provided me something that I don't really get to see a whole lot in the SpongeBob reviewing type sphere on this site. Because it's really cathartic to see someone who's not super familiar with SpongeBob to watch one of the more infamous episodes from this show's history and, you know, end up liking it. I've always had the belief that people should watch these seasons for what they're doing, rather than just compare them to previous seasons. But even still, humor is subjective at the end of the day, and I don't expect you to like this episode the same way I like this episode. But I think now's a good time to probably end the video right here. So hopefully you like this video, and bye bye!